The letter was taped to Daniel's front door. Bright red letters screamed, "Notice of violation," the kind that made neighbors stop, whisper, and walk faster. Daniel froze, keys in his hand, his pulse quickening. His truck sat in the driveway, spotless, polished, not even a scratch. And yet the letter accused him of excessive oil stains, unauthorized parking, and vehicle non-compliance. His chest tightened. Oil stains? Unauthorized? None of it was true. His driveway was clean enough to eat off. But the HOA board didn't care about truth. They cared about power. From across the cul-de-sac, 3 HOA members stood watching, arms folded, smug smiles plastered across their faces. "Read it carefully," one of them, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tone, called out. "Violations accrue daily fines. Non-payment leads to legal action. That's how it works." Her voice carried, loud enough for every neighbor to hear. Daniel clenched the letter, humiliation searing through him like fire. He wanted to shout, to demand fairness, but his throat locked. The HOA board thrived on intimidation. They picked targets, new residents, quiet ones, anyone who wouldn't fight back. And Daniel, he'd just moved in 2 months ago. He was still unpacking boxes, still grieving. The cul-de-sac seemed to tilt as memories rushed back. His brother's hand on his shoulder at their father's funeral, promising, "I'll protect you. Always." But his brother wasn't here. He was 3 towns over, buried in police work. Daniel was alone. At least that's what they thought. Because what the HOA didn't know, what would soon unravel their entire scheme, was that his brother wasn't just a cop. He was the sheriff. And this time, Daniel wasn't staying silent. Daniel moved to Meadowbrook Estates for peace. The neighborhood looked perfect from the outside. Trimmed hedges, glossy side eaves. Alks, kids on bikes. But beneath the surface, the HOA ruled like a shadow government. They issued fines for grass half an inch too tall, for leaving Christmas lights up one day too long, for having the wrong shade of beige on a mailbox. Neighbors whispered about them behind closed doors, but never resisted. "They're bullies," whispered Mrs. Alvarez, the widow next door. "But fight them, and they'll bury you in paperwork, legal fees, fines." She trailed off, fear in her eyes. Daniel listened quietly, but every story lit a spark inside him. His first letter had claimed his truck, a Ford F-150 he kept spotless, was commercial and non-compliant. Soon the fines snowballed. $150, $300, $500. When Daniel tried attending an HOA meeting, they cut him off saying, "All violations are final. Read the bylaws." His voice didn't matter. The worst part wasn't the money. It was the humiliation. Neighbors began avoiding him, as though guilt was contagious. Parents pulled their kids away when his truck drove past. He was being painted as a troublemaker. And then came the most vicious blow. A letter accusing him of reckless endangerment because his truck was blocking children's sightlines. It was parked perfectly in his own driveway. Daniel stared at the paper until his hands shook. His father used to tell him, "Son, there are 2 kinds of people, those who abuse power and those who stand against it." That night, Daniel sat at his kitchen table. The stack of HOA fines spread like weapons. He dialed a number he hadn't called in months. "Danny?" came the voice, deep, steady, instantly familiar. His throat tightened. "Hey, Mark. Tell me what's wrong." Daniel explained everything. Every fine, every humiliation, every time they laughed in his face. When he finished, silence stretched across the line. Finally, his brother spoke. "I'm coming." Mark didn't just come. He arrived the next morning, sheriff's badge gleaming on his chest, patrol SUV parked bold as daylight in front of Daniel's house. Neighbors peeked through blinds, whispers rippling like wildfire. The HOA board members watched from across the street, their smug expressions faltering for the first time. Daniel felt something stir inside him. Hope. The HOA president, Mr. Crawford, was a man who thrived on control. Crisp suits, icy smiles, and a reputation for breaking anyone who crossed him. When he saw Mark at Daniel's door, his jaw tightened. "This is private property," Crawford barked when Mark approached the HOA office that afternoon. "Sheriff's Department has no business here." Mark's gaze was calm but razor-sharp. "Harassment is my business. False citations, targeted intimidation, extortion through fines. Ring a bell?" Crawford's smile returned, thin and venomous. "Our bylaws are law here. He signed them when he bought the house. Sheriff or not, you can't change that." But what happened next shocked everyone. Mark didn't argue. He pulled out a folder, thick, heavy. "These aren't just complaints from my brother. I've got statements from 6 other residents. Documented harassment, fraudulent fines, selective enforcement. You've been targeting people who can't fight back. Seniors, widows, immigrants. My department calls that abuse of authority." Gasps echoed through the small office. Board members shifted uncomfortably. Crawford's face drained of color. "You're bluffing," he spat. Mark leaned in. "Try me." That night, whispers raced through Meadowbrook Estates. The sheriff was investigating the HOA. Crawford's empire of fear was cracking. But Crawford wasn't finished. He doubled down. The next morning, Daniel woke to find his truck booted, bright orange, clamped to the wheel. A fresh letter screamed, "Vehicle seizure pending." Neighbors gathered, murmuring in disbelief. Daniel's hands shook as rage boiled over, but before he could speak, Mark stepped forward. He flashed his badge, voice cutting like steel. "Remove it, now." The HOA enforcers froze. The crowd held its breath. For the first time, the board looked small. And that's when the tide began to turn. The showdown came at the next HOA meeting. The community hall was packed. Neighbors who'd once stayed silent now filled every seat, anger simmering. Daniel sat in the front row, Mark standing tall beside him. Crawford banged his gavel. "This meeting is for HOA members only." Mark's voice thundered. "Good! I'm here as a member's representative and as sheriff of this county." The room erupted in whispers. Mark began pulling files from his folder, slamming them on the table one by one. Violation letters with no basis. Fines issued selectively. Financial records showing HOA funds misused. Vacations charged to community dues. Luxury dinners written off as meetings. Want me to keep going? The board members shifted, sweat beading on foreheads. Crawford tried to object, but his words tangled. Then Mark dropped the final blow. "We also found evidence of discrimination. Residents of color fined for things their white neighbors were not. That's not just unfair. That's illegal." The room gasped. A Latina mother in the back began to cry quietly. Mrs. Alvarez gripped her cane, whispering, "Finally." Crawford's face twisted. "You can't prove—" But Mark cut him off, sliding photographs and sworn statements across the table. "We can, and we will." Silence fell, heavy and absolute. Then Daniel stood. For the first time, his voice didn't shake. "You tried to humiliate me. You tried to bury me in lies, but you forgot one thing. Justice doesn't scare." The crowd roared with applause. And in that moment, the board crumbled. One member resigned on the spot. Another broke down, admitting everything. Crawford stormed out, pale and defeated. The HOA's reign of terror was over. In the weeks that followed, Meadowbrook Estates transformed. The HOA was audited. Crawford faced charges: fraud, embezzlement, discrimination. His empire of fear dissolved into dust. New elections were held, this time fair and open. Neighbors who once hid in silence found their voices again. Daniel's truck sat proudly in his driveway, untouched, gleaming in the sunlight. Children rode past on bikes, waving. Mrs. Alvarez baked pies again, her laughter floating through the air. And Daniel? He finally felt peace. Not just because the fines were gone, but because the shadows had lifted. Because justice had returned. One evening, he and Mark sat on the porch, sipping coffee as cicadas hummed in the distance. "You didn't just save me," Daniel said quietly. "You saved this whole neighborhood." Mark smiled faintly. "That's what brothers are for." Daniel leaned back, staring at the stars. For the first time in months, he could breathe. He knew the scars of the HOA's cruelty would linger, but so would the lesson. Power only wins when silence lets it. And here in Meadowbrook Estates, silence was broken forever. The story didn't end with fear. It ended with freedom. And in that freedom, Daniel finally felt at home.